Hey there, welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that all gardeners love to talk about. Whether you're a new gardener or you're an experienced gardener, I don't think we can ever get enough companion planting talk because we all want to try to incorporate companion planting a little bit more in a way that works well for our gardens. When I say companion planting, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe it's excitement and possibility, the potential of creating a beautiful, diverse garden space with plants that benefit each other. Or maybe it's skepticism. Maybe you're not sure you believe all the companion planting advice and the charts that you see online. Or maybe it's confusion. The whole concept seems nice but unattainable. You aren't even sure how to plant a garden with a few veggies, and now we're talking about mixing and matching. If you're a beginner, that's totally where I was as well. I have felt all of those emotions throughout my garden journey, throughout 12 years of gardening. I thought all of these thoughts to varying degrees. And to those of you who are skeptical, honestly, you have the right to be. There's a lot of information online that may not be accurate or reliable, and at best, unproven. So, whether you're skeptical, hopeful, confused, or a mix of them all, my goal today is to help bring clarity to this kind of gardening that truly does bring benefit and delight. And it's not near as difficult as it seems. But first, let's cut through some myths. This episode is brought to you by Organic Rev. If you love Organic Rev and you'll be seed starting indoors, you'll love their seed starting mix, Dakota Peat. Made with Organic Rev's source material, Dakota Peat improves water retention and nutrient availability in seed starting mixes, creating an ideal growing environment for seeds to sprout quickly and thrive. To use, blend 10 to 15% with your regular seed starting mix and get 10% off of your order. Just go to organicrev.com and the link is in the show notes. Myth number 1, certain plants always boost the growth of others. I think that's one thing that gardeners are always wanting to figure out. Like, how can I make one plant make another plant better? Many of us are familiar with the Three Sisters method of planting. It's very popular. It is where you plant corn, beans, and squash all together. Many believe that the Native Americans practiced this, and I've actually personally tried it. I'm not a huge fan of it personally, but a lot of people do like it, and it was fun to try. I'm glad that I did for sure. And there is some reason behind why these three could potentially thrive together. I never had that experience, but there is reason to believe. But the thing is that most of the time, when people are talking about one plant actually benefiting another plant, now benefiting and working okay together are two different things. But when we're talking about actually one benefiting another, a lot of this lacks rigorous scientific validation. But a lot of times home gardening ways of doing things like companion planting isn't something that is researched all that much. Most of the time the research is done on large-scale agriculture, understandably. Even without research, though, not all pairings deliver noticeable benefits. When we're talking about companion planting, plants interact in complex ways, and this is often influenced by soil, water, pests, and competition. Scientific research supports some beneficial pairings, but claims often rely on anecdotal evidence. Let's look at a couple of examples. You will often see that you should plant tomatoes and basil together. This is mostly anecdotal. I'm not aware of any rigorous studies that have been performed to see if basil or tomatoes actually do better when they're planted together, but still, it is a pairing that I always use because I enjoy it in my garden. Some people believe that planting basil next to their tomatoes improves the flavor. But I would imagine, unless you have some kind of a way to test that, like a Brix meter, a lot of that's going to be subjective. But still, both plants thrive under similar conditions, so they typically do fine together. But is planting basil next to your tomato going to help your tomato yield? That's up for debate. Another combination would be planting radishes next to spinach or radishes next to carrots. Radish is a quick growing crop, so often when you're planting, the radish can help to mark where you planted the slower growing crops like spinach and carrots, at least slower to germinate. And what that does is it also helps outcompete the weed seeds so that the carrots or so that the spinach seeds can get a good footing. So that is a benefit of the site, of how that your site performs. And then your radishes are pretty quick to grow, so they'll come out quickly, allowing the other crops to take over. That's a beneficial companion for sure, but is the radish actually helping the spinach grow per se? Probably not, but there are some benefits. My personal take is that when it comes to planting crops to help another crop, here's my personal take. I really can't point my finger that some crops help others per se, and from my research, the benefits are limited. But even the claims that beans and peas provide nitrogen for growing plants that are right next to them is disputed. One reliable source will say, yes, it will happen in the middle of the season, but the other source says, no, you have to wait till later before you see any noticeable benefits. So I don't even know what to believe. But to me, it doesn't really matter, because as long as other factors like shade, competition, and all of that are taken into account, it's not going to hurt different crops to be planted next to each other. And we're going to be talking about those things, shade, competition, because that makes a bigger difference, in my opinion, than does one plant actually benefit the other. But I'm hoping there'll be more research on this, because if plants are able to help them like as they're growing, I think that would be a fantastic thing to know as a home gardener. Myth number 2, companion planting prevents all pests. While certain plants can deter specific pests, companion planting is not a foolproof pest control method. I cringe when I see someone online say, well, I planted this herb so that it would keep away this. Well, there could be a deterrent factor for sure, but is it going to mean that you're never going to have that problem pest? Probably not. But there is something to this. Some plants release compounds that do deter pests, but others rely on attracting beneficial insects. So they do help, but they help in different ways. And it's important to understand that it will help, but not always will it be the thing that you can completely rely on. Let's give a couple of examples. Marigolds and nematodes. French marigolds helping with nematodes. French marigolds in particular, I am going to totally butcher this Latin name, but Tagetes patula. That is the specific kind of marigold that is effective here. They actually do produce compounds that help suppress certain nematode populations in the soil. However, the effectiveness depends on the marigold species and the planting density. And this benefit happens the following year after marigolds are turned over in the soil. So while it may help what's growing there, most of the research that I've been able to see, unless there's been something that's been new since I've looked at it, most of it points to the benefit being seen the following season, of it actually having to, the plant debris actually getting into the soil. Still, marigolds are still a great companion plant, but is it going to be the be-all end-all? Probably not. Another example is dill and cabbage. Dill attracts wasps that prey on cabbage worms. So planting dill in a raised bed with brassicas can help reduce pest damage. However, I will tell you that I am not going to rely on dill to protect my broccoli and my cabbage from the cabbage worm. I'm going to rely on insect netting, because even if it does attract that parasitic wasp, I have not found it to be 100% effective, because I have done this before, still got cabbage worms. I'm not saying it didn't have an effect, but it's not something I'm going to hang my hat on. Then we have herbs and insect repellents. Herbs like rosemary and sage are thought to repel certain insects. And while there may be some deterrent effects, again, relying solely on these herbs for pest control in intensive planting systems may not yield the results that you're looking for. I hope you're getting where I'm going here. Effective plant management often requires more than just relying on companions to do all the work for you. Effective pest management often requires an integrated approach, which includes cultural practices like crop rotation, removing plant debris that harbor pests, mulching. It also includes biological controls like planting flowers that attract beneficial insects, or even experimenting with planting trap crops. And when necessary, sometimes we do have to get out the organic pesticides, as little as possible in my garden, but sometimes it does happen. What we do know is that a diverse garden attracts beneficial insects and creates a balance to our garden, and it's absolutely beautiful. And it never hurts to try. Even if you see something online, even if you hear something, it doesn't hurt to try. Let me give you an example. You may have heard me talk about this before, but when I was visiting with Tammy, my friend, and she's the owner of Green Thumb Nursery, we've got a couple of YouTube videos with her. When I was visiting with her at her garden, she was telling me that she plants petunias and then she didn't have any trouble with tomato worms. And I was like, does that really work? I mean, my first thought was skepticism. And she's like, well, I don't have hornworms. And I'm like, okay, well, it's worth a try. So I planted, I think, maybe 2 tiers of my green stalk planter last year with petunias, which was pretty close to my tomatoes. And I didn't have tomato hornworm until after my petunias were pretty much on the fritz. And I don't know if that was coincidence. It may have been. But my whole thing is it doesn't hurt to try. Just because there's maybe no research on petunias and tomato hornworms doesn't mean it may not work in your garden. So even though I think it's wise to approach companion planting thoughts and things we see online with a healthy dose of skepticism, what harm is there ever in trying to plant a flower next to a vegetable? I mean, for the most part, it's not going to hurt anything. So why not try? And maybe you do find that it's something that helps you. Myth number 3, plants will always thrive together if paired correctly. Even with beneficial pairings, plants have individual needs for space, nutrients, and water. Overcrowding, especially in intensive planting systems like raised beds, can lead to competition and reduced yields. Even plants that are considered good companions can fail if other conditions aren't met, like spacing and water and light requirements. One thing I love about raised beds is that it enables intensive planting. I love being able to pack as much as I can into my raised beds, but I've learned the hard way that careful planning is needed to avoid overcrowding and nutrient depletion. One thing, even in an intensive planting method like a raised bed, that we need to keep in mind is root systems, how big they're going to grow, and what their nutrient and water needs might be. So let's take basil and tomatoes. Again, it's one that I'm often pairing in my garden. And while they do well together, they also can compete for water in small spaces. So if you're going to plant basil and tomatoes together, then making sure that you add drip irrigation and making sure that they stay hydrated is going to be key to make sure that both crops get adequate hydration. One thing that you'll see online that may be a little bit confusing, it's something that I think is good to keep in mind, and I think experienced gardeners can probably do this or may be doing this already, is to consider the root systems. I mentioned this before. How are they growing? And we talked a little bit about the depth of the root systems in last Friday's episode, but this can be a little bit complicated, especially if you're a new gardener. And it doesn't always apply based on your season. In a home gardening setting, it's hard to cut through the noise of all of this. And even in researching this for you, I found examples of how some crops may not do well because of how their root systems may compete. My first thought was, how is a home gardener, especially a beginner, supposed to know this without extensive study? So if I ask you, or if I even ask myself, like, what's the root system of a pepper look like? Like, how deep is it? How wide is it? And I don't know that I could actually tell you that. So how is someone who is an everyday person supposed to know this? And the other thing that I thought was, the examples that they gave has not always been my experience. So let me give you an example that I found online. And this is why we always have to, like, whatever we do, we need to be really careful and critically think through what we're seeing. But one example that I read was that onions planted too densely, if they're planted with peppers, like peppers and onions are good companions. but if they're planted too densely, they can crowd out pepper roots. I have never found this to be a problem in my garden, but the reason is because in my climate in Arkansas, I harvest onions early. So my onions are harvested usually in June, sometimes the beginning of July, but typically June. Well, my peppers usually don't go in till the beginning of May. And so they're not super large. I mean, they're just starting to get growing in June. And by that time, my onions are out. I've never had an issue with peppers and onions. Also, onions do need full sun, and peppers, if they get too tall, they can overcrowd onions. So peppers and onions may not be a great combination if you live in an area where there's too much overlap between the two. Whereas in my garden, because they grow in different times, then I don't have that problem with those as companions. So that's another reason to be careful with what kind of companion charts that you see that are good or bad, because there may be other climate factors that a lot of times you just have to learn as you get experience. But that's why just taking these charts as like this is the truth, there's other factors that sometimes you need to consider. But if you're new, here's the takeaway. More than anything, keep plant spacing in mind and then just try things and observe and see how they grow. This is something I'm still doing. It's one thing that I realized this year. For the second year, I planted peppers and watermelon together in a raised bed, and the watermelons didn't do very well either year. And last year I had a bad watermelon year anyway, just because of the weather. This year I realized it wasn't the weather. But the thing that made me not sure what was going on is that I have planted peppers and watermelons together before, and they did fantastic. Both of them did. But the difference is that I had one pepper plant and one watermelon plant together in a bed, and they did fine. But these last couple of times, I had like 8 pepper plants and 8 watermelon plants in a 3x7 space. And so, yeah, technically I was following plant spacing. Technically, it should have worked just fine. But I believe that all of those so close together, even though they had plenty of water, I don't think that they had enough nutrients in general, or they were just out competing. So all that to say, 12 years in, I'm still trying things and I'm still observing things. And so companion planting is not something that you can necessarily, get 100% the first try. It's something that you keep trying. But that is one of the benefits of gardening, is that it never gets old and you always get to try things and break some rules. If you see something online that says don't plant this next to this, unless you can find a reason, a scientific reason why this might be a bad idea, why not try it? Why not try it? And I'm not one to break rules in general, but I've learned to approach this all with a healthy bit of skepticism. And sometimes I've found some good pairings that nobody would really think would work, and it actually did work pretty well. If you've been listening to the podcast the last couple of weeks, you know that this is your last opportunity to join my free live workshop, The Productive Gardener's Blueprint. We have 4 class times to choose from starting today, February 18th, and we have 2 others on Thursday, February 20th. I will show you the strategies I've used for years to plan and grow a productive garden in 3 and now even 4 seasons. Just go to journeywithjill.net/masterclass to save your seat. And seats in this class are limited, so don't wait. And also, because so many of you have been waiting for this, as of today, my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, is now open for our February enrollment. I know so many have been telling me you've been waiting for this. And one bonus that you'll get when you enroll is access to my mini course, Companion Planting 101. So if this episode is inspiring you with ideas and helping you know that yes, you can companion plant successfully, Companion Planting 101 will show you how to do it, while Dream to Garden will help you incorporate it into your garden plan. To enroll, go to journeywithjill.net/dream-to-garden. Open enrollment is only for a limited time. Both links to the free live workshop today or Thursday, pick whatever works best for you, and Dream to Garden are in the description. Now back to our final 2 companion planting myths. Myth number 4, you don't have to worry about how tall plants grow. I'm not sure that anybody ever actually thinks that, but we sometimes act that way. We don't realize how tall plants grow and how that can affect the growth of other plants around them. Shade, for sure, can benefit some crops, like cool season crops, as we talked about on Friday, but it can also stunt the growth of sun-loving plants or plants that just need sun and then they're in the shade the whole time. With that in mind, strategic planting is necessary to ensure mutual benefit for both plants, especially in raised beds where space is limited. So how do we do that? And this is something I go into a lot more in Companion Planting 101, but the most important thing is to consider south. Smaller plants like bush beans, peppers, carrots can be planted next to taller crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, and okra, but err and plant them to the south of these crops or west or east if you have to choose something other than south, but avoid north. Because what will happen is that if you plant these crops on the north side of a taller crop, then it's not going to get a whole lot of sun. Now, in contrast, in the summer, the north actually may be ideal if you're trying to get a cool weather crop to go longer in the summer. So I'm basically telling you the opposite, but hopefully you can understand the difference here. If I'm planting beans, they need full sun. So I want to make sure they're not getting shaded by tomatoes. But if I'm planting lettuce, or maybe I plant lettuce first, then I may plant lettuce on the north side and then plant tomatoes later to the south side of the lettuce to help it to shade a little bit more. Hope you see where I'm going with that. But the whole point is to keep shade in mind. Now, let me give you an example of something that I found online. Again, this is something just for you to see that I read it online, I did it, and here's what happened. So I saw online that beans and carrots are good companion plants. And the rationale that I found online is that beans fix nitrogen in the soil for the carrots, which that makes sense. We know that beans fix nitrogen in the soil. And then the root systems are a little bit different because the root systems of the beans are a little bit more shallow, and then the carrots are going to be a little bit deeper. So they're accessing different parts of the soil, different nutrients. So I planted them together. But the way that I did it, this was several years ago, my pole beans on an A-frame trellis. So picture a triangle, and they're on both sides of this triangle trellis. And I planted my carrots right below them. But what I didn't realize is that doing that made them shaded. And the reason they were shaded was because the pole beans were growing up the triangle. So they were creating this canopy of shade. And that made it where those carrots that year were not large at all. The tops didn't get larger, the roots didn't get larger. And I realized it was because they were under the shade of the pole beans, which inhibited their growth. So I think beans and carrots are still good companions. But if I were to do it again, I would make sure that I planted my carrots on the side of the beans that didn't get that canopy of shade. Or I'd plant the beans in a more vertical, like up a hog panel trellis, and then make sure to plant the carrots on that side. I think some of the biggest mistakes that I've ever made in companion planting, and I still make them, I'm like, I should have known better than that, is I don't consider the mature crop and how much shade it's going to cast. So always when you're considering your garden layout and where you're going to put different crops, consider how tall is this plant going to grow? And once it grows that tall, how much shade is it going to cast? And are my crops I'm planting next to it, do they need sun or can they tolerate the shade? Myth number 5, companion planting is only for pest control. Now, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I want to return to it. Companion planting enhances pollination, soil health, and biodiversity, especially in raised beds. I love it. For pollination, it helps when we plant early flowers, like for me, nasturtium, cosmos. They attract bees for those early cucumbers, those early squash. And then if we have zinnias, for instance, later in the season, they again attract pollinators, they attract bees, which helps all of your ecosystem thrive. Companion planting also helps with soil health. We know that there are nitrogen fixing plants like clovers, crimson clover, hairy vetch. Those are cover crops, but then we also have our beans, black-eyed peas, anything in the legume family. And some of those same crops, especially your clovers, can suppress weeds while enriching the soil and attracting pollinators. Like crimson clover and hairy vetch, they are a haven for beneficial insects. And then we have biodiversity, which I touched on before. Our gardens are going to be healthier when it's mixed, when we have more things in the garden than just monocrop rows. Plants take up different nutrients, microorganisms have diverse food sources, etc. We have so many more benefits than just for pest control. And I say that mainly because I think most of what I hear online is we want to do companion planting to keep out the pests, but there's so much more benefit to companion planting than just that. In conclusion, what I want you to take away from today's episode is that companion planting does not require extensive knowledge. That's one reason in Companion Planting 101, which if you get Dream to Garden, you get this included. I try to break it down into the basics because really it's the basics that you need to know that's going to make the biggest difference. Sure, you can go down a rabbit hole and review all the studies that have been done. I've done that. It's kind of fun. You can explore the science behind the good and bad pairings and even read what some farmers do on a larger scale. I'm talking about more of your organic farmers that are experimenting with these types of things. It's really fascinating. And while I've done this to some degree, I haven't found it necessary to find success in my home garden setting. All I really had to understand was some basics. Some of them, which I shared with you today, but the others I dive deeper into, both in Dream to Garden and Companion Planting 101. But the bottom line is you can do it with just some basic information. And I hope that cutting through some of these myths today has helped you. And I hope it's helped you to see that if you came into this episode hopeful, you can see the different possibilities. If you came in skeptical, maybe you can see that maybe companion planting isn't the be all end all, but it still has benefits. Or maybe if you were confused, I hope that I cut through the confusion just a little bit for you. And as just a reminder, I hope to see you in the free live workshop today or Thursday. Don't forget to go grab your seat if you haven't yet at journeywithjill.net/masterclass to sign up. I'll see you there. And if you are there live, you hopefully will be able to win one of the giveaways we'll be giving away live there. But just for registering, you'll be entered to win a big giveaway that has lots of prizes from our partners. I'm so excited to share with you this year. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you again on another episode on Friday where we'll have a bonus episode. We'll talk about something I have never talked about before. So make sure you are subscribed and I will chat with you again on Friday.